Chapter 10, The Law of Liberty. Natural Liberty. Question 825. Are there any positions in life in which a man may flatter himself that he enjoys absolute freedom? And the answer, no, because all of you, the greatest as well as the least, have need of one another. Question 826. In what condition of life could a man enjoy absolute freedom? And the answer, that of a hermit in a desert. As soon as two men find themselves together, they have reciprocal rights and duties to respect, and are therefore no longer absolutely free. Question 827. Does the duty of respecting the rights of others deprive a man of the right of belonging to himself? And the answer, in no wise, for he holds that right from nature. Question 828. How can we reconcile the liberal opinions professed by some persons with the despotism they themselves sometimes exercise in their own houses and among their subordinates? And the answer, their intelligence is aware of the law of nature, but this perception is counterbalanced by their pride and selfishness. When their profession of liberal principles is not hypocrisy, they know what ought to be done, but do it not. Follow-up question. Will their profession of liberal principles in the earthly life be of any avail to such persons in the other life? And the answer, the more clearly a principle is understood by the intellect, the more inexcusable is the neglect to put it into practice. He who is sincere, though simple, is farther advanced on the divine road than he who tries to appear what he is not. Slavery. Question 829. Are men intended by nature to be the property of other men? And the answer, the absolute subjugation of any man to another man is contrary to the law of God. Slavery is an abuse of strength. It disappears with progress, gradually as all other abuses will disappear. Kardec adds, the human law which sanctions slavery is a law against nature, because it assimilates man to the brute, and degrades him physically and morally. Question 830. When slavery is already established in the habits of a people, are those who profit by that institution to blame for conforming to a usage which appears to them to be natural? And the answer, what is wrong is always wrong, and no amount of sophistry can change a bad deed into a good one. But the responsibility of wrongdoing is always proportional to the means of comprehending it possessed by the wrongdoer. He who profits by the institution of slavery is always guilty of a violation of natural law. But in this, as in everything else, the guilt is relative. Slavery having become rooted in the habits of certain peoples, men may have taken advantage of it without seeing it to be wrong, and as sometimes which appeared to them altogether natural. But when their reason, more developed and enlightened by the teachings of Christianity, has shown them that their slave is their equal in the sight of God, they are no longer excusable. Question 831. Does not the inequality of natural aptitudes place some of the human races under the sway of other races of greater intelligence? And the answer, yes, in order that the latter may raise them to a higher level, but not that they may brutify them still more by slavery. Men have too long regarded certain human races as working animals furnished with arms and hands, which they have believed themselves to have the right of using and selling like beasts of burden. They fancy themselves to be of pure blood. Fools who only see matter. It is not the blood that is more or less pure, but only the spirit. Question 832. There are men who treat their slaves humanely, who let them want for nothing, and who think that freedom would expose them to greater privations. What do you say of such persons? And the answer, I say that they have a better understanding of their own interest than those who treat them cruelly. They take the same care of their cattle and horses in order to get a better price for them at market. They are not so guilty as those who treat them badly, but they none the less treat them as merchandise, by depriving them of the right of belonging to themselves. Freedom of thought. Question 833. Is there in man something that escapes constraint, and in regards to which he enjoys absolute liberty? And the answer, yes. In his thought, man enjoys unlimited freedom, for thought knows no obstacles. The action of thought may be hindered, but not annihilated. Question 834. Is man responsible for his thoughts? And the answer, he is responsible for them to God. God alone can take cognizance of thought and condemn or absolves it according to his justice. Freedom of conscience. Question 835. Is freedom of conscience the natural consequence of freedom of thought? And the answer, conscience is an inner thought that belongs to man, like all his other thoughts. Question 836. Has man the right to set up barriers against the freedom of conscience? And the answer, no, no more than against freedom of thought, for God alone has the right to judge the conscience. If man by his laws regulates the relations between men and men, God by the laws of nature regulates the relations between men and God. Question 837. What is the effect of the hindrances opposed to freedom of conscience? And the answer, to constrain men to act otherwise than as they think, and thus to make hypocrites of them. Freedom of conscience is one of the characteristics of true civilization and of progress. Question 838. Is every honest belief to be respected, even when completely false? And the answer, every belief is worthy of respect when it is sincere and when it leads to the practice of goodness. Blamable beliefs are those which lead to the practice of evil. Question 839. Is it wrong to scandalize those who believe is not the same as our own? And the answer, to do so is to fail in charity and to infringe on freedom of thought. Question 840. Is it an infringement of the freedom of conscience to place hindrances in the way of beliefs that are of a nature to cause social disturbance? And the answer, you can only repress action. Belief is inaccessible. Kardec adds, the repression of the external acts of a belief, when those acts are injurious to others, is not an infringement on the freedom of conscience, for such repression leaves the belief itself entirely free. Question 841. Ought we, out of respect for freedom of conscience, to allow the propagation of pernicious doctrines, or may we, without infringing upon that freedom, endeavor to bring back into the path of truth those who are led astray by false principles? And the answer, most certainly you not only may, but should do so, but only by following the example of Jesus, by employing gentleness and persuasion, and not by resorting to force, which would be worse than the false belief of those whom you desire to convince. Conviction cannot be imposed by violence. Question 842. All doctrines claiming to be the sole expression of the truth, by what signs can we recognize the one which has the best right to call itself such? And the answer, the truest doctrine will be the one that makes the fewest hypocrites and the greatest number of really virtuous people, that is to say, of people practicing the law of charity in its greatest purity and in its most widest application. It is by this sign that you may recognize a doctrine as true, for no doctrine of which the tendency to make divisions and demarcation among the children of God can be anything but false and pernicious. Free will. Question 843. Has man freedom of action? And the answer, since he has freedom of thought, he has freedom of action. Without free will, man would be a machine. Question 844. Does man possess free will from his birth? And the answer, he possesses free will from the moment when he possesses the will to act. In the earliest portion of a lifetime, free will is almost null. It is developed and changes its object with the development of the faculties. The child, having thoughts in harmony with the wants of his age, applies his free will to the things which belong to that age. Question 845. Are not the instinctive predispositions that a man brings with him at birth an obstacle to the exercise of his free will? And the answer: a man's instinctive predispositions are those which belong to his spirit before his incarnation. If he is but little advanced, they may incite him to wrongdoing, in which he will be seconded by spirits who sympathize with that wrongdoing. But no incitement is irresistible when there is a determination to resist. Remember that to will is to be able. Question 846. Has not our organism an influence on the acts of our life? And if so, does not this influence constitute an infringement of our free will? And the answer: spirits are certainly influenced by matter, which may hamper them in their manifestations. This is why, in worlds in which the body is less gross than upon the earth, the faculties act more freely, but the instrument does not give the faculty. In considering this question, you must also distinguish between moral faculties and intellectual faculties. If a man has the instinct of murder, it is assuredly his spirit that possesses this instinct, and not his organs. He who annihilates his thoughts, in order to occupy himself only with matter, becomes like the brute, and still worse, for he no longer endeavors to preserve himself from evil. And it is this which constitutes his culpability, because he does so of his own free will. Question 847. Does aberration of the mental faculties deprive man of free will? And the answer: he whose intelligence is deranged by any cause whatever is no longer master of his thoughts, and thenceforth is no longer free. Mental aberration is often a punishment for the spirit who, in another existence, has been vain or haughty, or has made a bad use of his faculties. He may be reborn in the body of an idiot, as the despot may be reborn in the body of a slave, and the hard-hearted possessor of riches in that of a beggar. But the spirit suffers from this constraint, of which he is fully conscious, and it is in this constraint that you see the action of matter. Question 848. Is the aberration of the mental faculties produced by drunkenness an excuse for the crimes committed in that state? And the answer: no, for the drunkard has voluntarily deprived himself of his reason in order to satisfy his brutish passions. He thus commits not one crime, but two. Question 849. What is the dominant faculty of a man in the savage state? Is it instinct or free will? And the answer: instinct, which, however, does not prevent his acting with entire freedom in certain things. But, like the child, he uses his freedom for the satisfaction of his needs, and obtains its development only through the development of his intelligence. Consequently, you, who are more enlightened than the savage, are more blamable than the savage if you do wrong. Question 850. Does not social position sometimes place obstacles in the way of freedom of action? And the answer: society has undoubtedly its limits. God is just and takes everything into account, but he will hold you responsible for any lack of effort on your part to surmount such obstacles. Fatality. Question 851. Is there a fatality in the events of life, in the sense commonly attached to that word? That is to say, are the events of life ordained beforehand, and if so, what becomes of free will? And the answer: there is no other fatality than that which results from the determination of each spirit on incarnating himself to undergo such and such trials. By choosing those trials he makes for himself a sort of destiny, which is the natural consequence of the situation in which he has chosen to place himself. I speak now of physical trials only, for as regards moral trials and temptations, a spirit always preserves his freedom of choice between good and evil and is always able to yield or to resist. A good spirit, seeing he may hesitate, may come to his aid, but cannot influence him to the extent of mastering his will. On the other hand, a bad spirit, that is to say, a spirit of inferior advancement, may trouble or alarm him by suggesting exaggerated apprehensions. But the will of the incarnated spirit retains, nevertheless, its entire freedom of choice. Question 852. There are persons who seem to be pursued by a fatality independent of their own action. Are not their misfortunes in such cases the result of predestination? And the answer, they may be trials which those persons are compelled to undergo, because they have been chosen by them in the spirit state. But you often set down to destiny what is only the consequence of your own faults. Try and keep a clear conscience, and you will be consoled for the greater part of your afflictions. Kardec adds, the true or false view we take of the things about us causes us to succeed or to fail in our enterprises, but it seems to us more easy and less humiliating to our self-love to attribute our failures to fate or to destiny than to our own mistakes. If the influence of spirits sometimes contributes to our success, it is none the less true that we can always free ourselves from their influence by repelling the ideas they suggest when they are calculated to mislead us. Question 853. There are persons who escape one danger only to fall into another. It seems as though it had been impossible for them to escape death. Is there not a fatality in such cases? And the answer, there is nothing fatal in the true meaning of the word, but the time of death. When that time has come, no matter under what form death presents itself, you cannot escape it. Follow-up question. If so, whatever danger may seem to threaten us, we shall not die if our hour has not come. And the answer, no, you will not be allowed to die, and of this you have thousands of examples. But when your hour has come, nothing can save you. God knows beforehand the manner in which each of you will quit your present life, and this is often known also to your spirit, for it is revealed to you when you make choice of such and such existence. Question 854. Does it follow from the inevitability of the hour of death that precautions we take in view of the apparent danger are useless? The answer, no, for those precautions are suggested to you in order that you may avoid the dangers with which you are threatened. They are one of the means employed by Providence to prevent death from taking place prematurely. Question 855. What is the aim of Providence in making us incur dangers that are to be without result? And the answer, when your life is imperiled, it is a warning which you yourself have desired, in order to turn you from evil and to make you better. When you escape from such a peril, while still feeling the emotion excited by the danger you had incurred, you think more or less seriously, according to the degree in which you are influenced by the suggestions of good spirits, of amending your ways. The bad spirit returning to his former post of temptation, I say bad in reference to the evil that is still in him, you flatter yourself that you will escape other dangers in the same way, and you again give free scope to your passions. By the dangers you incur, God reminds you of your weakness and of the fragility of your existence. If you examine the cause and the nature of the peril you have escaped, you will see that in many cases its consequences would have been the punishment of some fault you have committed, or of some duty you have neglected. God thus warns you to look into your hearts and to pursue the work of your self-amendment. Question 856. Does a spirit know beforehand the kind of death to which he will succumb in the earthly life? And the answer, he knows that he exposed himself by the life he has chosen to die in some particular manner rather than in another. but he also foresees the efforts he'll have to make in order to avoid the danger, and he knows that, if God so permit, he will escape it. Question 857. There are men who brave the perils of the battlefield with the full persuasion that their hour is not come. Is there any foundation for such confidence? And the answer: a man often has a presentiment of his end. He may in the same way have a presentiment that his time for dying has not yet come. These presentiments are due to the action of his spirit protectors, who may wish to lead him to hold himself ready to go away, or to raise his courage in moments when he has special need of it. They may also come to him from the intuition he has of the existence he has chosen, or of the mission he has accepted, and which he knows as a spirit that he has to fulfill. Question 858. How is it that those who have presentiment of their death generally dread it less than others? And the answer: it is the man, and not spirit, who dreads death. He who has the presentiment of his death thinks of it rather as a spirit than as a man. He understands that it will be a deliverance and awaits it calmly. Question 859. If death is inevitable when the time appointed for it has arrived, is it the same in regard to all the accidents that may happen to us in the course of our life? And the answer: they are often small enough to permit of our warning you against them, and sometimes of enabling you to avoid them by the direction we give to your thoughts. For we do not like physical suffering, but all of this is of little importance to the life you have chosen. The true and sole fatality consists in the hour at which you have to appear in and disappear from the sphere of corporeal life. Follow-up questions: are there incidents which must necessarily occur in a life and that the spirits will not avert? And the answer: yes, but those incidents you, in your spirit state, foresaw when you made your choice. But nevertheless, you must not suppose that everything which happens to you was written, as people express it. An event is often the consequence of something you have done by an act of your free will, so that had you not done that thing, the event would not have taken place. If you burn your finger, it is not because such an incident was preordained, for it is a trifling inconvenience resulting from your own carelessness and a consequence of the laws of matter. It is only the great sorrows, the events of serious importance and capable of influencing your moral state, that are foreordained by God, because they will be useful to your purification and instruction. Question 860. Can a man, by his will and his efforts, prevent events that were to have occurred from taking place, and vice versa? And the answer: he can do so if the seeming deviation is not compatible with the life he has chosen. And in order to do good, which should be and is the sole end of life, he may prevent evil, especially that which may contribute to a still greater evil. Question 861. Did the man who commits a murder know, in choosing his existence, that he would become a murderer? The answer: no. He knew that by choosing a life of struggle, he incurred the risk of killing one of his fellow creatures, but he did not know whether he would or would not do so. For there is almost always deliberation in the murderer's mind before committing the crime, and he who deliberates is evidently free to do so or not to do. If a spirit knew beforehand that he would commit a murder, it would imply that he was predestined to commit that crime. No one is ever predestined to commit a crime, and every crime, like every action, is always the result of determination and free will. You are all too apt to confound two things essentially distinct: the events of material life and the acts of moral life. If there is sometimes a sort of fatality, it is only in those events of your material life of which the cause is beyond your action and independent of your will. As to the acts of the moral life, they always emanate from the man himself, who, consequently, has always the freedom of choice. In those acts, therefore, there is never fatality. Question 862. There are persons who never succeed in anything, and seem to be pursued by an evil genius in all their undertakings. Is there not in such cases something that may be called a fatality? And the answer, it is certainly a fatality if you like to call it so, but it results from the choice of the kind of existence made by those persons in the spirit state, because they desired to exercise their patience and resignation by a life of disappointment. But you must not suppose that this fatality is absolute, for it is often the consequence of a man having taken a wrong path, one that is not adapted to his intelligence and aptitudes. He who tries to cross a river without knowing how to swim stands a very good chance of drowning, and the same may be said in regard to the greater part of the events in your life. If a man undertook only the things that are in harmony with his faculties, he would almost always succeed. What causes his failure is his conceit and ambition, which draws him out of his proper path, and makes him mistake for a vocation which is only a desire to satisfy those passions. He fails, and through his own fault, but instead of blaming himself, he prefers to accuse his star. One who might have been a good workman and earn his bread honorably in that capacity prefers to make bad poetry and dies of starvation. There would be a place for everyone if everyone put himself in his right place. Question 863. Do not social habits often oblige a man to follow one road rather than another? And is not his choice of occupation often controlled by the opinion of those about him? Is not the sentiment which leads us to attach a certain amount of importance to the judgment of others an obstacle to the exercise of our free will? And the answer, social habits are made not by God, but by men, if men submit to them. It is because it suits them to do so, and their submission is therefore an act of their free will, since if they wish to enfranchise themselves from those habits, they could do so. Why then do they complain? Is it not social habits that they should accuse, but their pride, which makes them prefer to starve rather than to derogate from what they consider to be their dignity? Nobody thanks them for their sacrifice to opinion, though God would take note of the sacrifice of their vanity. We do not mean to say that you should brave public opinion unnecessarily, like certain persons who possess more eccentricity than true philosophy. There is as much absurdity in causing yourself to be pointed out as an oddity, or stared at as a curious animal, as there is wisdom in descending voluntarily and unmurmuringly when you are unable to maintain yourself at the top of the social ladder. Question 864. If there are persons to whom fate is unpropitious, there are others who seem to be favored by fortune, for they succeed in everything they undertake. To what is this to be attributed? And the answer, in many cases to their skillful management of their affairs, but it may also be a species of trial. People are often intoxicated by success. They put their trust in their destiny and pay for their former successes by severe reverses, which greater prudence would have enabled them to avoid. Question 865. How can we account for the run of luck that sometimes favors people under circumstances with which neither the will nor the intelligence have anything to do, in games of hazard, for instance? And the answer, certain spirits have chosen beforehand certain sorts of pleasures. That luck which favors them is a temptation. He who wins as a man often loses as a spirit. Such kick is a trial for his vanity and his cupidity. Question 866. The fatality which seems to shape our material destinies is, then, a result of our free will? And the answer, you yourself has chosen your trial. The severer it is, and the better you bear it, the higher you do raise yourself. Those who pass their lives in the selfish enjoyment of plenty and of human happiness are cowardly spirits who remain stationary. Thus, the number of those who are unfortunate is much greater in your world than those of who are fortunate, because spirits generally make choice of the trial that will be most useful to them. They see too clearly the futility of your grandeurs and your enjoyment. Besides, the most fortunate life is always more or less agitated, more or less troubled, if only by the absence of sorrow. Question 867. Whence comes the expression, born under a lucky star? And the answer, from an old superstition that connected the stars with the destiny of each human being, a figure that some people are silly enough to take for literal truth. Foreknowledge. Question 868. Can the future be revealed to man? And the answer, as a rule, the future is hidden from him. It is only in rare and exceptional cases that God permits it to be revealed. Question 869. Why is the future hidden from man? And the answer, if man knew the future, he would neglect the present and would not act with the same freedom, because he would be swayed by the thought that if such and such a thing is to happen, there is no need to occupy oneself about it, or else he would seek to prevent it. God has willed that it should not be thus, in order that each may concur in the accomplishment of the designs of Providence, even of those which he would desire to thwart, and thus you, yourselves, often prepare the way, without you knowing it, for the events that will occur in the course of your life. Question 870. Since it is useful that the future should be hidden, why does God sometimes permit it to be revealed? And the answer, because in such cases this foreknowledge, instead of hindering the accomplishment of the thing that is to be, will facilitate it by inducing the person to whom it is revealed to act in a different way from that in which he would otherwise have acted. And, besides, it is often a trial. The prospect of an event may awaken thoughts more or less virtuous. If a man becomes aware, for instance, that he will succeed to an inheritance which he had not expected, he may be tempted by a feeling of cupidity, by elation at the prospect of adding to his earthly pleasures, by a desire for the death of him to whose fortune he will succeed, in order that he may obtain possession of it more speedily. Or, on the other hand, this prospect may awaken in him only good and generous thoughts. If the prediction be not fulfilled, it is another trial, vis-a-vis that of the way in which he will bear the disappointment. But he will none the less have acquired the merit or the blame of the good or bad thoughts awakened in him by his expectation of the event predicted. Question 871. Since God knows everything, he knows whether a man will or will not fail in a given trial. Where then is the use of this trial, since it can show God nothing that he does not already know in regard to that man? And the answer, you might as well ask why God did not create man accomplished, perfect, or why man has to pass through childhood before arriving at adult age. The aim of the trial is not to enlighten God in regard to man's deserts, for God knows exactly what they are, but to leave to man the entire responsibility of his conduct, since he is free to do or not to do. Men having first choice between good and evil, trial serves to bring him under the action of temptation, and thus to give him the merit of resistance. For God, though knowing beforehand whether he will triumph or succumb, cannot, being just, either reward or punish him otherwise than according to the deeds he has done. Kardec adds, the same principle is practically admitted among men. Whatever may be the qualifications of a candidate for any distinction, whatever may be our confidence of his success, no grade can be conferred on him without his having undergone the prescribed examination, that is to say, without his deserving having been tested by trial just as a judge only condemns the accused for the crime he has actually committed, and not on the presumption that he could or would commit such crime. The more we reflect on the consequences that would result from our knowledge of the future, the more clearly do we see the wisdom of Providence in hiding it from us. The certainty of our future good fortune would render us inactive. That of coming misfortune would plunge us in discouragement. In both cases, our activities would be paralyzed. For this reason, the future is only shown to man as end which he is to attain through his own efforts, but without knowing the sequence of events through which he will pass in attaining it. The foreknowledge of all the incidents of his journey would deprive him of his initiative and of the use of his free will. He would let himself be drawn passively by the force of events down the slope of circumstances without any exercise of his faculties. When the success of a matter is certain, we no longer busy ourselves about it. Theoretic summary of the springs of human action. Question 872. The question of free will may be thus summed up. Man is not fatally led into evil. The acts he accomplishes are not written down beforehand. The crimes he commits are not the result of any decree of destiny. He may have chosen as trial and as expiation an existence in which, through the surroundings amidst which he is placed, or the circumstances that supervene, he will be tempted to do wrong, but he always remains free to do or not to do. Thus a spirit exercises free will in the spirit life, by choosing his next existence and the kind of trials to which it will subject him, and in the corporeal life, by using his power of yielding to or resisting the temptations to which he has voluntarily subjected himself. The duty of education is to combat the evil tendencies brought by the spirit into his new existence, in which it will only be able to thoroughly fulfill when it shall be based on the deeper and truer knowledge of man's moral nature. Through knowledge of the laws of this department of his nature, education will be able to modify it, as it already modifies his intelligence by instruction and his temperament by hygiene. And the answer: each spirit, when freed from matter and in the state of erraticity, chooses his future corporal existences according to the degree of purification to which he has already attained, and it is in the power of making this choice, as we have previously pointed out, that his free will principally consists. This free will is not annulled by incarnation, for if the incarnated spirit yields to the influence of matter, it is always to the very trials previously chosen by him that he succumbs, and he is always free to invoke the assistance of God and of good spirits to help him to surmount them. Without free will, there would be for man neither guilt in doing wrong, nor merit in doing right, a principle so fully recognized in this life that the world always apportions its blame or its praise of any deed to the intention, that is to say, the will of the doer, and the will is but another term for freedom. Man therefore could not seek an excuse for his misdeeds in his organization without abdicating his reason and his condition as a human being, and assimilating himself to the condition of the brute. If he could do so in regard to what is wrong, he would have to do the same in regard to what is right. But whenever a man does what is right, he takes good care to claim the merit of his action, and never thinks of attributing that merit to his organs, which proves that he instinctively refuses to renounce, at the bidding of certain theory builders, the most glorious privilege of his species, vis-a-vis freedom of thought. Vitality, as commonly understood, supposes an anterior and irrevocable ordaining of all the events of human life, whatever their degree of importance. If such were the order of things, man would be a machine without a will of his own. Of what use would his intelligence be to him, seeing that he would invariably be overruled in all of his acts by the power of destiny? Such preordination, if it took place, would be the destruction of all moral freedom. There would be no such thing as human responsibility, and consequently neither good nor evil, neither virtues nor crime. God, being sovereignly just, could not chastise his creatures for faults which they had not the option of not committing, nor could he reward them for virtues which would constitute for them no merit. It would be, moreover, the negation of the law of progress, for if man were thus dependent on fate, he would make no attempt to improve his position, since his action would be both unnecessary and unavailing. On the other hand, fatality is not a mere empty word. It really exists in regard to the position occupied by each man upon the earth, and the part which he plays in it, as a consequence of the kind of existence previously made choice of by his spirit as trial, expiation, or mission, for in the virtue of that choice he is necessarily subjected to the vicissitudes of the existence he has chosen, and to all the tendencies, good or bad, inherent in it. But fatality ceases at this point, for it depends on his will to yield or not to yield to those tendencies. The details of events are subordinated to the circumstances to which man himself gives rise by his action, and in regard to which he may be influenced by the good or bad thoughts suggested to him by spirits. There is a fatality, then, in the events which occur independently of our action, because they are the consequence of the choice of our existence made by our spirit in the other life. But there can be no fatality in the results of those events, because we are often able to modify the results by our own prudence. There is no fatality in regard to the acts of our moral life. It is only in regard to his death that man is placed under the law of an absolute and inexorable fatality, for he can neither evade the decree which has fixed the term of his existence, nor avoid the kind of death which is destined to interrupt its course. According to the common belief, man derives all his instincts from himself. They proceed either from his physical organization, for which he is not responsible, or from his own nature, which would furnish him with an equally valid excuse for his imperfections, as, if such were the case, he might justly plead that it is through no option of his own that he has been made what he is. The doctrine of Spiritism is evidently more moral. It admits the plenitude of man's free will, and in telling him that, when he does wrong, he yields to an evil suggestion made by another spirit, it leaves him the entire responsibility of his wrongdoing, because it recognizes his power of resisting that suggestion, which it is evidently more easy for him to do than it would be to fight against his own nature. Thus, according to Spiritist doctrine, no temptation is irresistible. A man can always close his mental ear against the occult voice, which addresses itself to his inner consciousness, just as he can close it against a human voice. He can always withdraw himself from suggestions that would tempt him to evil by exerting his will against the tempter, asking of God at the same time to give him the necessary strength and calling on good spirits to help him in vanquishing the temptation. This view of the exciting cause of human action is a natural consequence of the totality of the teaching now being given from the spirit world. It is not only sublime in point of morality, it is also eminently fitted to enhance man's self-respect, for it shows him that he is as free to shake off the yoke of an oppressor as he is to close his house against unwelcome intrusion, that he is not a machine set in motion by an impulsion independent of his will, that he is a reasoning being with the power of listening to, weighing, and choosing freely between two opposing counsels. Let us add that, while thus counseled, man is not deprived of the initiative of his action. What he does of his own motion, because he is still a spirit, though incarnated in a corporeal envelope, and still preserves as a man the good and bad qualities he possessed as a spirit. The faults we commit have their original source, therefore, in the imperfection of our own spirit, which has not yet acquired the moral excellence it will acquire in the course of time, but which nevertheless is in full possession of its free will. Corporeal life is permitted to us for the purpose of purging our spirit of its imperfections through the trials to which we are thus subjected, and it is precisely those imperfections that weaken us and render us accessible to the suggestions of other imperfect spirits, who take advantage of our weakness in trying to make us fail in the fulfillment of the task we have imposed upon ourselves. If we issue victorious from the struggle, our spirit attains a higher grade. If we fail, our spirit remains as it was, no better and no worse, but with the unsuccessful attempt to be made over again, a repetition of the same trial that may retard our advancement for a very long period. But in proportion as we effect our improvement, our weakness diminishes and we give less and less handle to those who would tempt us to evil. And as our moral strength constantly increases, bad spirits cease at length to act upon us. The totality of spirits, good and bad, constitute by their incarnation the human race, and as our earth is one of the most backward worlds, more bad spirits than good ones are incarnated in it, and a general perversity is visible among mankind. Let us then do our utmost not to have to come back to it, but to merit admission into a world of higher degree, one of those happier worlds in which goodness reigns supreme, and in which we shall remember our sojourn in this lower world only as a period of exile. For those interested in learning more about Spiritism, you can find the entire The Spirits book on PDF. Look up Allan Kardec /PDF on your favorite search engine. If you wish to explore more about the levels of heaven and the attributes of a spirit and the future of earth, I suggest you read my series of 3 books, starting with Heaven and Below, next Spirits and the Spirit Universe, and the 3rd book, How Spirits Guide Us. God bless.